The automatic doors at Brookhaven Senior Living opened with a soft, mechanical sigh, and Eleanor Mercer stepped through them, carrying nothing but a green suitcase and 82 years she had not been asked about. The suitcase was too light. That was the first thing she noticed, the way it swung easily at her side instead of pulling her arm down the way real luggage should. Denise had packed it the night before, while Nell sat in the recliner pretending to watch the weather report, and when Nell had asked what was going in it, Denise said, "Just enough for now, Mom. We'll bring more later." Nell had not argued. She had learned, somewhere in the last 6 months, that arguing only made her daughter's voice go tight and careful, the voice people use with children and with the very old, and Nell was not ready to be spoken to that way in her own kitchen. The lobby smelled like most public buildings that tried too hard to smell like nothing. A flat chemical clean laid over something warmer and staler underneath. Coffee that had sat too long, the ghost of 100 lunch trays. A television bolted high in the corner played a game show to no one. Somewhere down a hallway, a cart rattled, wheels clicking against linoleum in a rhythm Nell's hands recognized before her mind did, the small stutter click of casters that needed oil. "Right this way," the woman at the front desk said, not unkindly, sliding a clipboard toward Gary. "If you could just fill out the emergency contact information and initial here, here, and here." Gary took the clipboard the way a man takes a form he has already half filled out in his head. He did not sit down next to his mother. He stood at the counter with his shoulders angled slightly away from her, the posture of someone trying to get through a task before the feeling attached to it could catch up to him. Nell sat in a vinyl chair with wooden armrests worn pale at the edges from decades of hands gripping them. And she set the suitcase beside her feet, and she folded her hands in her lap, the way her mother had taught her to sit in church 60 years before that. Her fingers ached in the joints, the old familiar ache, worse in weather like this, damp and gray outside the tinted windows. "Will your family be visiting today?" the receptionist asked her directly, leaning around Gary with a kindness that felt, in that moment, almost unbearable. Nell looked toward the parking lot through the tinted glass. Denise's white SUV, which had been idling near the entrance 20 minutes before, was gone. "I imagine they have things to do," Nell said. She did not say it bitterly. She had spent 82 years learning not to make her voice sound the way her chest felt. And she was not about to unlearn that skill in a lobby that smelled like bleach and canned soup, in front of a stranger with a clipboard and a name tag that said Brittany. Gary signed the last line, capped the pen, and finally turned to her. "I'll come by this weekend, Ma," he said. "Get you settled in first, let you get used to things." "Of course," Nell said. He bent down and kissed the top of her head, the way he had since he was too tall to do it any other way. And for 1 second, his hand rested on her shoulder with something that might have been guilt, or might have been nothing more than the automatic gesture of a son leaving his mother somewhere. Then he was gone, through the automatic doors, into the gray afternoon, and Nell sat alone with a suitcase that weighed almost nothing, and a stranger asking her to sign a form confirming she understood the facility's fall risk protocol. She signed it. Her signature had changed over the decades, rounder in her 20s, sharper and more efficient by her 40s, and now, at 82, slightly tremorous, the E of Eleanor, beginning with a small hesitation before it committed to the page. But it was still recognizably hers. It was still, she thought, the same hand that had once signed something far more important than a fall risk waiver in a different building, in a different decade, when her name had not yet been Mercer at all. She did not think about that signature very often anymore. It belonged to a life that had closed itself up so gradually, over so many years, that she had stopped noticing the door was shut. A young aide named Priya walked her down a hallway lined with framed prints of lighthouses and sailboats, past a day room where a dozen residents sat in a loose semicircle around a muted television, past a nurse's station with a whiteboard listing names and room numbers and diet restrictions in blue dry erase marker. Room 114 had a single bed, a nightstand, a small dresser, a vinyl recliner by the window, and a bathroom with grab bars bolted to white tile. "Home sweet home," Priya said, and then seemed to hear how it sounded, and softened. For now, anyway. Lots of folks find it's not so bad once they settle in. Nell set the suitcase on the bed and did not open it right away. She stood at the window instead, looking out at a small courtyard with 2 benches and a bird bath that had gone dry, and beyond it a chain-link fence, and beyond that a strip of gray Ohio sky pressing down over the parking lot. When she finally unzipped the suitcase, she found what she expected. 3 changes of clothes, her nightgowns, a framed photograph of Robert from their 30th anniversary, her rosary, a bottle of the arthritis cream that never worked as well as it promised. Denise had packed practically. Denise had always been practical. It was, Nell thought, one of the things she had once been proudest of in her daughter, before it had become the thing that frightened her most. Tucked into a side pocket, wrapped in an old handkerchief, was a small cloth pouch, and inside the pouch a machinist's caliper, its brass fittings worn smooth and dark with age, its steel jaws still closing with the same small, precise click they had made for 60 years. Nell did not know if Denise had packed it on purpose or if it had simply been sitting in the drawer of the nightstand and gotten swept up with everything else. She suspected the latter. Denise would not have recognized it as anything worth including. To her daughter, it was an old tool, rusted at the hinge with disuse, the kind of thing you kept in a junk drawer because throwing it away felt wasteful, not because it mattered. Nell sat down in the vinyl recliner, opened the pouch, and took the caliper into her hands. She closed the jaws slowly, feeling for the small resistance, and then the tiny metallic click, familiar as a heartbeat. Measure before you decide, Eric Halverson had told her 64 years ago, in a machine shop that smelled like cutting oil and hot metal, on the day he'd pressed this same caliper into her 16-year-old palm. You can eyeball a piece all day and be wrong. But the tool doesn't care what you hoped the number would be. It only tells you what's true. She had not thought of Eric Halverson in years, not really thought of him, the way you think of someone whose voice you can still hear clearly enough to argue with. But sitting in a strange room with a suitcase that weighed nothing, she thought of him now, and of a red notebook that was still, somewhere, in a box, in her son's garage or a storage unit. she had signed the papers for without quite reading them, and of a young man named Arthur Vale, who had once shaken her hand in a parking lot and told her that someday, when his company amounted to something, people would know what she'd done. She had believed him in the offhand way you believe a young man's promises. And then life had simply gone on the way it does, filling up the space where that promise might have mattered with marriages and mortgages and a daughter's croup and a son's broken arm, until the promise was not so much broken as buried under 30 years of ordinary living. Nell closed the caliper's pouch, set it on the nightstand beside Robert's photograph, and looked out the window at the dry bird bath until the light began to fail. She had not always been a woman other people looked past. In 1962, when Eleanor Halverson was 18 years old, she had walked into Continental Gauge and Tool on the east side of Dayton, wearing a borrowed pair of her older brother's work boots because her own shoes weren't sturdy enough for the floor, and she had been the only girl in a hiring line of 40 men. The foreman, a broad, weathered Norwegian named Erik Halvorsen, no relation, though the coincidence of the shared name had made them both laugh the first week, and something like family ever since, had almost sent her home. "We don't usually," he'd started to say, and then stopped, because Nell had reached past him to the calibration bench where a half-finished part sat rejected in the reject bin, picked it up, turned it over twice in her hands, and said, "This one's not out of round. It's the fixture. Your locating pin's worn." Erik had looked at her for a long moment. Then he'd walked over, checked the fixture pin with his own gauge, and found she was right. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "My father ran a garage," Nell said. "I used to help him true up wheel hubs before school." She started the following Monday, on the floor, running a bench grinder and later a small lathe, one of only 2 women in a shop of 90 men, most of whom treated her with either an exaggerated, uncomfortable politeness or a low, grinding resentment she learned to work around the way you work around a burr in a piece of stock, carefully, so it doesn't cut you, but without pretending it isn't there. Erik took her under his wing in the plain, undramatic way older men in trades sometimes did, with someone who reminded them of themselves at a younger age, before life had worn the edges off. He taught her to read a micrometer to the 10,000th of an inch. He taught her the difference between a part that was wrong and a process that was wrong, which was, he told her more than once, the most important distinction a person in this line of work would ever learn, and one that applied to more than metal, though he never explained what he meant by that, and she was too young then to ask. And on a gray Tuesday in the spring of 1962, 3 months into the job, he'd handed her a small cloth pouch. "This was my father's," he said. "It's a good caliper, better than the shop calipers, truth be told. Those get dropped and knocked around by every fool on the floor. This one's been cared for. I want you to have it." "I can't take your father's tool, Mr. Halverson." "You can, and you will," he said, in the tone that ended an argument before it started. "A tool's only worth something if somebody uses it right. You use things right. Measure twice, cut once, they say, but that's not really it. It's not about being careful for carefulness' sake. It's that once you cut, you can't uncut it. So you measure first, and you measure again, and you don't let anybody, not your foreman, not your customer, not your own impatience, talk you into skipping that step. The tool doesn't lie. People do, sometimes without even meaning to. Trust the tool. Nell had carried that caliper in her coat pocket, and later in a small leather bag, for 64 years. She had used it to true up parts, to check her children's height against the doorframe when the tape measure went missing, to measure the depth of a crack in the foundation of the house on Ridgeline Drive, before she called a contractor so she'd know if he was lying to her about how bad it was. It had outlasted 3 coats, 2 houses, and a husband. It had also, in 1964, played a small and entirely unglamorous role in saving a 24-year-old man's company from going under before it had properly begun. Arthur Vail had come to Continental Gauge in the fall of 1964 as a subcontractor's headache, not as anyone's idea of a future titan of industry. He was 24 years old, wiry, talked too fast, and had somehow convinced a small aerospace supplier out of Cincinnati to give his 2-man machine shop, Vail Precision, which at the time consisted of Arthur, 1 employee named Duke Ferris, and a single rented bay in a converted feed warehouse, a trial order for 300 bearing sleeves for a hydraulic actuator assembly. The trouble was that Arthur's sleeves kept failing dimensional inspection after heat treatment. Not all of them, maybe 1 in 6, but the customer's tolerance was tight enough that 1 in 6 was a fatal ratio. Vail Precision didn't have the capital to eat that kind of scrap rate, and it certainly didn't have the reputation yet to survive a failed first order. Arthur had gone to Continental Gauge, the only shop within 50 miles with a heat-treat furnace he could rent time on, half desperate and trying not to show it. And it was there, standing at the intake counter, arguing with a technician about whether the furnace's temperature gauge was reading true, that he first crossed paths with a young woman holding a clipboard and a caliper. "It's not the furnace," Nell said, without being asked. She had been walking past with a tray of finished parts and had overheard enough of the argument to form an opinion which was, at the time, a habit that got her in trouble more often than it got her praised. "Can I see one of the rejects?" Arthur, surprised enough to stop arguing, handed her one of the failed sleeves. Nell turned it over in her hands, checked it with her caliper at 3 points around its circumference, and frowned. "It's out of round," she said, "but only after it cools. If you check it right out of the quench, it's fine. It's warping as it comes down to room temperature. So it is the furnace. No, if your furnace ran hot or cold, you'd see the same problem consistently on every part, not 1 in 6. This is something in how the parts sit while they cool. How are you racking them?" Duke Ferris, standing behind Arthur with the sheepish look of a man who suspects he already knows the answer, admitted they were stacking the sleeves 3 high on the cooling rack to save time, since the customer wanted the order fast and the rack space was limited. Nell nodded slowly, the way a person nods when a puzzle they hadn't realized they were solving suddenly resolves. The bottom sleeves are carrying the weight of the one stacked on top of them, while the metal's still soft from the heat. It's not much weight, but it doesn't take much, right at that temperature, to nudge a thin-walled part out of true before it sets. You're getting your 1 in 6 because that's roughly the fraction sitting at the bottom of a stack. Arthur stared at her. You worked that out from looking at one reject. I worked it out from looking at your rack, Nell said, nodding toward the cooling area behind him, where indeed the sleeves were racked in stacks. The part's not lying to you. It's just telling you something you weren't asking it. Arthur Vale did not forget that sentence for the rest of his life, though it would be many years before he told Nell so. They fixed it within the week, a simple redesign of the cooling rack that separated each sleeve on its own pin, a change that cost Vale Precision $11 in scrap steel and an afternoon of Duke Ferris's welding time. The rejection rate dropped from 1 in 6 to functionally 0. The Cincinnati order shipped on time, in spec, and Vale Precision's tiny, trembling reputation survived its first real test. Arthur, in the weeks that followed, kept finding reasons to come back to Continental Gauge, and kept finding reasons to talk to the quiet young woman on the floor who noticed things other people didn't. He was not courting her, not in any romantic sense. Nell was already by then quietly engaged to a machinist named Robert Mercer, who worked 2 benches down, and Arthur knew it, and respected it without comment. What Arthur wanted from Nell was simpler and, in its own way, more valuable to him. He wanted her eyes. He began bringing her problems the way other men brought her flowers, laying failed parts on the counter and asking, half joking, half desperate, "What's it telling you that I'm not hearing?" In February of 1965, Vale Precision landed a larger contract, a run of spindle assemblies for a valve manufacturer, the kind of order that could either establish the company as a serious supplier or bury it for good if quality slipped. 3 weeks into production, they hit a wall nearly identical in shape to the first one, but this time in a component critical enough that a failure could not be quietly reworked. Nell, on her lunch break, and then increasingly on her own time in the evenings, worked through the geometry of it with Arthur at the counter of Continental Gauge, sketching cross-sections on the backs of order forms, until they isolated the cause. A fixture again, but this time a subtler flaw, a locating surface machined a few thousandths out of true that was inducing a stress pattern invisible until the part went through its final grind. The fix took 11 days and cost Vale Precision nearly everything it had in the bank. It worked. Arthur Vale, sitting in the gravel lot behind Continental Gauge on the night the corrected parts passed final inspection, told Nell, 21 years old, engaged, still living with her parents to save money for the wedding, that he didn't know how to thank her, and that if the company ever amounted to anything, he wasn't going to forget who had kept it alive. "You don't owe me anything," Nell had told him. "I like solving the puzzle. That's payment enough." But Arthur, who even at 24 had a stubborn streak that would later be described in magazine profiles as visionary, and by at least one ex-business partner as maddening, had not accepted that answer. A few weeks later, he'd shown up at Continental Gauge with a typed letter, drafted, Nell would learn decades later, by a lawyer friend of his father's, a favor rather than a paid engagement, which was part of why the language was simple enough for a 21-year-old machinist to understand without a lawyer of her own, offering her a 2% participation in net revenue, derived specifically from what he called, in the letter, the corrected spindle process and its direct derivatives, in recognition of her contribution to the company's survival. "You don't have to sign this," Arthur told her, "but I want you to have it. Nobody's going to remember me building this company out of a feed warehouse if I don't tell them the truth about how it happened. And the truth is, it wouldn't have happened without you." Nell had read the letter twice. 2% of a company that at the time existed almost entirely on paper and hope sounded to her like 2% of nothing. A kind gesture from a proud young man who wanted to feel he'd paid a debt, rather than a document with any real financial weight. She'd shown it to her father, who had squinted at it over his reading glasses and said, "Can't hurt you to sign it, Ellie. Cost you nothing." She had signed it in the front seat of Robert's Chevrolet, using the dashboard as a table, laughing a little at the formality of it. And then she had folded it into the back pages of a red notebook she'd been keeping since her first week on the floor, a notebook full of measurements and sketches, and the small daily record of a young woman teaching herself a trade, and she had not thought about the letter again for a very long time. 6 months later, she married Robert Mercer. A year after that, Denise was born, and Nell left Continental Gauge for what she believed, at the time, would be a temporary leave. It was not temporary. Robert's mother fell ill that same year and needed care that fell, as it so often did in those years, onto the young wife rather than the middle-aged son. By the time Robert's mother passed, Nell was pregnant again with Gary, and the rhythm of the household had reorganized itself entirely around motherhood in a way that made a return to full-time shop work feel less like a choice deferred and more like a door quietly closing, one hinge at a time, without anyone ever slamming it. She did keep her hand in bookkeeping for a small tool distributor 2 towns over, evening classes in drafting that she never finished, occasional consulting favors for Eric Halverson when Continental Gauge hit a snag nobody else could solve. But the woman who had once stood at a counter reading a fixture's flaw from a single reject part became, slowly, and without any particular villain to blame, the woman other people knew as Bob Mercer's wife, and then as Denise and Gary's mother, and eventually as simply Nell, a name that carried none of the history folded into it. Arthur Vail's company grew. Vail Precision became Vail Precision Systems in 1971 when it moved out of the feed warehouse and into its first proper facility. It grew again in the 70s and 80s, riding first the aerospace boom, and then, more durably, a reputation for tight-tolerance manufacturing that made it a preferred supplier across half a dozen industries. The corrected spindle process, the one Nell had helped diagnose over sketches on the backs of order forms, became, without much fanfare, one of the foundational manufacturing methods the company built its later product lines around, refined and modified over decades, but traceable, if you knew where to look, straight back to a gravel lot in 1965. For the first several years, small checks did arrive at the Mercer household, tied to that 2% letter, modest amounts, $100 here, $300 there, deposited without much thought into the household account, and spent on the ordinary things a young family spends money on. Nell barely registered them as connected to anything larger than an old favor Arthur Vail seemed determined to keep paying. Then, in 1978, Continental Gauge and Tool was sold to a larger regional manufacturer. And in the reshuffling that followed, several old subcontractor and consulting arrangements, Nell's among them, were folded into a category the new accounting department labeled without much ceremony legacy obligations and routed for review. Around the same time, the Mercers moved from their small rental on the east side to a house on Ridgeline Drive in Kettering, a move that put them, unremarked upon by anyone at the time, on a different mail route with a different set of postal codes. A check addressed to Eleanor Halverson, her maiden name still on the original 1965 agreement, since she had signed it before her wedding, arrived at the old address in the summer of 1979 and was returned to sender undeliverable. Nobody at the small accounting department that had absorbed Continental Gage's paperwork thought much of it. Legacy obligations to a woman who no longer seemed reachable and who had never once called or written to ask where her payments were the kind of loose thread a busy office simply tied off and filed away. Arthur Vail, by then, was no longer signing individual checks himself. His company had grown past the size where a founder could track every obligation by hand, and he trusted his growing finance department to manage what he had, in his own mind, settled and closed years before. He believed in the vague, comfortable way successful men believe things they have not personally verified in a long time. That Eleanor Halverson, later Eleanor Mercer, though the name change was never properly logged in the file, was still receiving what she was owed. He had other fires to put out. He had a company to run, and somewhere in the space between his trust and his company's growing bureaucracy, an old debt to the woman who had saved his first real contract began, quietly and with no one person to blame, to disappear. The last documented payment against the account went out in 1981. After that, the file simply sat, growing in theoretical value as the spindle process it was tied to became more and more central to Vail Precision Systems' expanding business, but touched by no human hand, checked by no auditor, remembered by no one currently employed at the company for the next 45 years. Nell, for her part, never chased it. She had married for love, not money, and Robert Mercer earned a steady, if unspectacular, wage at the GM plant that, combined with her own part-time work, was enough to raise 2 children in a modest but comfortable home. When the checks from Vail Precision stopped coming, she assumed, in the offhand way a busy mother assumes things she has no time to investigate, that the arrangement had simply run its course, the way informal promises between young people sometimes do once real life closes back in around them. She did not feel cheated. She barely felt the absence at all. She had a red notebook and a caliper, and a whole life she was living instead. And the small, faded memory of a letter signed on a car dashboard did not seem, at the time, like something worth pursuing. It would be 47 years before anyone at Vail Precision Systems opened that file again. The children Denise and Gary Mercer grew up in did not resemble, in any obvious way, the story their mother could have told them if she had ever thought to tell it, or if they had ever thought to ask. To Denise, born in 1967, her mother was the woman who clipped coupons at the kitchen table on Sunday nights, who kept a coffee can of loose buttons, sorted by size, who mended torn school clothes instead of replacing them, and who, when Denise was 13 and desperate for a particular pair of jeans every other girl at Fairmont Junior High already owned, had said, not unkindly, but firmly, that the jeans she already had still had wear left in them. Denise had absorbed, over the years, a quiet and largely unexamined belief that her mother had simply never had much, not because anyone told her so directly, but because frugality, when a child watches it without context, reads as scarcity rather than as a value someone might choose on purpose. By the time Denise was an adult, she had built an entire private mythology around her mother's modest means, one that made her mother's caution around money look less like discipline and more like limitation, an old woman's outdated fear of a world that had moved on. Gary, 4 years younger, had a gentler read on the same facts, but arrived, in practice, at a similar place. He remembered his mother fixing his bicycle chain instead of buying a new one, remembered her keeping a drawer of what she called good rubber bands salvaged from newspapers, remembered the particular satisfaction on her face when she repaired something rather than replaced it. And he had grown into an adult who loved his mother sincerely, but who thought of her, when he thought of her at all in terms of capability, as someone whose competence belonged to a smaller, more manageable world. Recipes, sewing, the occasional household repair. It never occurred to him, not once in 52 years, that his mother had ever stood in a machine shop reading the geometry of a failed fixture out of a single ruined part. He had heard, vaguely, that she'd worked in a factory before she married his father, the way you might hear that a grandparent once played a musical instrument, a fact filed away as backstory, not as evidence of anything. Neither of Nell's children was cruel by nature. That was, in its own way, the most painful truth of what happened to her, harder to reckon with than if either of them had simply been unkind people. Denise loved her mother. Gary loved his mother, and it was precisely because they loved her within the limited frame they had built of who she was, a frail, careful, financially modest widow whose life had narrowed down to coupons and casseroles and Sunday phone calls, that they were able to make the decisions they made about her future without ever really consulting the fuller person still living inside that frame. The trouble that finally moved things had been building for 2 years before the day Nell arrived at Brookhaven with her suitcase. Denise, at 59, ran a small real estate practice out of a strip mall office in Kettering and had, 3 years earlier, convinced herself and her husband, Mark, to take out a second mortgage against their own home in order to purchase a lakeside rental property near Lake Erie, a decision made on the confident promise of a market that had, since then, softened considerably. The rental sat empty more months than it filled. The mortgage payments came due every month regardless, and Denise had begun, quietly and without telling Mark the full extent of it, running up credit card debt to cover the gap. By the spring of the year, Nell moved into Brookhaven. Denise was, by her own private accounting that she shared with no one, nearly $40,000 underwater, with a balloon payment on the lake property's loan looming 18 months out. Gary, meanwhile, had no debts of his own to speak of, but he had a different kind of pressure, an aging back from 20 years of warehouse management work, a wife whose patience for unpaid caregiving duties had visibly thinned after Nell's second fall the previous winter, and a deep, conflict-averse temperament that made him far more likely to agree with whoever spoke first and most confidently in any family discussion. And in the Mercer family, that person was almost always Denise. The catalyst had been the second fall, a slip on the back steps in January, a hairline fracture in Nell's wrist, 3 days in the hospital, more out of caution than necessity, and a hospital social worker who had gently but firmly used the words, "She really shouldn't be living alone," in front of both children in a consultation room that smelled like the inside of every hospital consultation room in America. Denise had seized on that phrase the way a drowning person seizes a line thrown from shore. It gave a name, safety, to a decision that was, underneath, driven by something more complicated. The exhausting, unglamorous weight of worrying about an aging parent, tangled together, in Denise's case, with the quieter and less admissible awareness that her mother's house on Ridgeline Drive, free and clear after 30 years, sitting on a full acre in a neighborhood where property values had climbed steadily for a decade, represented the single largest asset any Mercer had access to. She never let herself think of it in those terms directly. That was, perhaps, the most human and most damning detail of all. Denise did not sit down one day and decide to take her mother's house. She told herself, across dozens of small conversations over 18 months, a story in which selling the house was simply the responsible thing to do. Too much upkeep for an elderly woman alone, too much liability, too far from either of her children, and besides, Nell herself had said more than once, and in more than one unguarded moment, that the house felt too big now that Robert was gone. Denise took that offhand grief and folded it into a plan. The power of attorney had been obtained during the hospital stay in January, at a moment when Nell, drowsy from pain medication and genuinely frightened by the fall, had signed a document Denise described to her as, "just in case so I can help with the bills while your wrist heals." A description that was not, technically, a lie, but was also not the whole truth of what the document authorized. Nell had signed it in a hospital gown, with an IV line taped to the back of her hand, trusting the daughter she had raised, in the particular vulnerable haze of a person recovering from a fall at 81 years old. And she had not read every clause, because reading every clause had never, in 81 years of trusting her own children, once seemed necessary. By March, Denise had listed the house on Ridgeline Drive. By May, it had sold, quickly, for a slightly under market in exchange for a fast close, to a young couple who had no idea the elderly woman whose photographs still hung in the front hallway during the showings had not, in any real sense, agreed to the sale so much as been informed of its progress after each step was already underway. Denise had explained the closing to Nell over the phone in a tone that treated the outcome as a foregone conclusion rather than a decision still open for discussion. "The market's good right now, Mom. We don't want to miss it." And Nell, hearing the confidence in her daughter's voice and not yet fully understanding how far along things already were, had murmured something that sounded like agreement, mostly because she did not yet have the vocabulary in that moment to object. Of the proceeds, a portion, Nell was told, vaguely. Most of it went into an account earmarked for her care. A second portion, smaller but still substantial, was quietly used by Denise to pay down the lake property's second mortgage and clear a portion of the credit card debt she had never disclosed to anyone, justified in her own mind as a loan against her eventual inheritance, a loan she fully intended, in some unspecified future, to repay. Gary, less directly involved in the financial mechanics, had gone along with the sale, the placement at Brookhaven, and the general shape of the plan, because Denise presented it all with such unshakable confidence that objecting felt, to him, less like standing up for their mother and more like picking an unnecessary fight with his sister. None of Nell's furniture made it into storage in any organized way. Some of it went to Gary's garage. Some went to a donation truck that came on a Saturday, while Nell was at a doctor's appointment Denise had scheduled for that exact hour. A box of photographs made it out. A box of Robert's tools did not, sold at an estate sale for $11, because nobody thought to ask Nell first whether she wanted to keep them. The red notebook, by pure and unremarked upon accident, ended up in a plastic tote in Gary's garage, mixed in among old tax documents nobody had bothered to sort, because it had been sitting in the same drawer as Robert's expired passport and a stack of canceled checks, and the woman packing that drawer, a helper Denise had hired for the day, a stranger to the family, had simply swept the entire drawer's contents into a box without a second glance. Nell did not fully understand, in the first days at Brookhaven, how permanent all of this was. She had told herself, the way she had told herself so many things over the preceding 18 months, that this was temporary, a period of adjustment, while her wrist finished healing, a trial arrangement, while Denise figured things out. It was not until her second week, when she asked an aide, almost casually, when she might expect to go home and get some more of her things, and the aide said with visible confusion, "Oh, I think your daughter said the house sold already, hon. Didn't she tell you?" That the full shape of what had happened arranged itself all at once in Nell's mind, the way a fixture's flaw sometimes reveals itself only when you finally look at the whole assembly instead of the single failed part. She sat very still in the vinyl recliner by the window for a long time after that conversation. She did not cry. She had never been a woman who cried easily, and 82 years of practice at not crying in front of other people held, even then. But something in her chest went cold and clear in a way it had not been before, a kind of stillness she recognized distantly from the machine shop floor, the particular quiet that comes after you've finally identified exactly what's wrong. And now, the only question left is what you're going to do about it. If you're watching this, maybe there's someone in your own life like Nell, a mother, a grandmother, a neighbor, someone whose whole history got quietly folded up into just grandma or just mom, until nobody thought to ask what she used to be capable of. If someone like that comes to mind, put their first name in the comments, or just a line about them. And if stories about people who get underestimated and then get their due matter to you, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, because there's a lot more of Nell's story still ahead. The wrist healed, the bruises from the fall faded, What did not fade, in the weeks that followed, was the particular grief of small discoveries, each one arriving separately, each one reopening a wound Nell had barely begun to accept. She discovered, 3 weeks in, that her mail had been forwarded to Denise's address rather than to Brookhaven. A bank statement she asked to see, only to be told by Denise, over the phone, in the careful voice, that "It's easier if I just handle the mail for now, Mom, so you don't have to worry about it." She discovered, a week after that, when a neighbor from Ridgeline Drive, a woman named Carol Ann Doyle, who had lived 3 houses down for 22 years and had heard nothing about the move until she saw a moving truck, called Brookhaven's main line asking to speak to Nell, that Carol Ann had tried twice before to reach her and had been told, both times by Denise, that Nell wasn't up for visitors right now. Nell had not known Carol Ann had called at all. She discovered, in a conversation with Gary during one of his Saturday visits, that Robert's tools were gone, sold at an estate sale she had never been told was happening, and Gary's face when he admitted it, a flush climbing up from his collar, his eyes sliding sideways toward the window, told her more than his stammered explanation did. "I thought Denise cleared that with you," he said. "I really did, Ma. I wasn't there for that part." "You weren't there for a lot of it," Nell said, and Gary had no answer for that, because it was true, and because some part of him had known, for months, that it was true, and had chosen the comfort of not looking too closely, rather than the discomfort of asking questions his sister might not want to answer. The clearest blow came in the 6th week, when a Brookhaven billing coordinator, a tired but well-meaning man named Terrence, sat down with Nell to review her account and mentioned, in passing, the monthly payment amount being drawn from an account he referred to as the proceeds account your daughter set up. Nell asked, evenly, what the total balance in that account was. Terrence did not know. He only handled the facility's portion, but the number he did know, the monthly draw, combined with a call Nell placed, hands trembling slightly, to the title company that had handled the closing on Ridgeline Drive, using a name and number she found by asking a Brookhaven receptionist to help her look up public property records, produced a sale price that did not match, by a significant and troubling margin, the amount Denise had told her was most of the proceeds sitting in her care account. Nell did not confront Denise immediately. She sat with the number for 3 days, turning it over, the way she used to turn over a rejected part, looking for the fixture that had failed rather than assuming right away that the part itself was simply bad. She told herself Denise might have costs to account for, closing fees, the cost of the estate sale, moving expenses. She tried, as she had tried for 18 months, to build her daughter an excuse sturdy enough to stand on. It was the caliper, oddly, that finally stopped her from finishing that excuse. She had been sitting with it in her hands one evening, running her thumb over the worn brass the way she had 10,000 times before, and she found herself thinking of Eric Halvorson's voice, the specific cadence of it. The tool doesn't lie. People do, sometimes, without even meaning to. She had spent her whole working life trusting a small steel instrument over her own hopeful assumptions, because the instrument didn't care what answer she wanted. And here she was, at 82, doing the opposite, with the one measurement that mattered most, assuming the best about a set of numbers that did not, by any honest accounting, add up, simply because the person behind those numbers was her daughter. And it hurt too much to measure her honestly. She closed the caliper. She set it down. And for the first time since the day at the reception desk, she let herself feel, without immediately excusing it away, the full weight of what had been done to her. She still did not know in that 6th week about Arthur Vale, about the letter folded into the back of a red notebook, sitting unopened in her son's garage, about the escrow account that had sat untouched and quietly accumulating for 45 years at Vale Precision Systems. She knew only that her family had made decisions about her entire life, her home, her possessions, her money, her future, without ever really asking her, and that the excuses she had been making for them, month after month, had been doing more work to protect her own heart than to reflect the truth of what had happened. She was still sitting with that realization, alone in room 114 on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, when Priya knocked on her door with an expression Nell had not seen on the young aide's face before, a kind of startled deferential confusion. "Mrs. Mercer," Priya said, "there's a man here to see you. He says—" She glanced back down the hallway, as if checking that what she was about to say was really true. "He's asking for someone named Eleanor Halverson." Arthur Vale was 86 years old, and he had not set foot inside a nursing home lobby in 11 years, not since his own sister's final months. And the particular institutional smell of the place hit him the moment the automatic doors parted. Disinfectant and old coffee, and something underneath that no amount of cleaning ever quite erased. He came in leaning on a cane he genuinely needed now, not for effect, wearing a gray wool coat that was expensive without announcing itself, trailed by his assistant, a sharp, quiet woman named Priscilla Odom, who carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and had, in the car on the way over, gently and repeatedly suggested that perhaps this was a conversation better handled first by phone. Arthur had refused. He had refused, in fact, rather more firmly than was typical for a man usually known, even at 86, for a controlled and courteous temperament. And Priscilla, who had worked for him for 19 years and knew the difference between his ordinary decisiveness and something with a rawer edge underneath, had not pushed a second time. The discovery had come 6 weeks earlier, during what should have been a routine exercise. Vale Precision Systems, now a company with revenues in the high hundreds of millions and a workforce of nearly 4,000 across 3 states, was in the process of a formal succession and legacy review ahead of a planned transition of leadership to Arthur's chosen successor, a long-time engineering executive named Thomas Reyes. Part of that review involved a full audit of the company's earliest historical and legal records, undertaken partly for legal cleanliness and partly, Arthur had admitted to almost no one, out of a genuine and increasingly urgent desire in what he understood to be one of the final active chapters of his life, to make sure the company's official history was accurate before he was no longer around to correct it. It was a young corporate archivist, a woman in her late 20s named Sofia Delgado, hired specifically for the project, who had found the file. It sat in a box of documents transferred decades earlier from Continental Gauge and Tools-absorbed records, labeled in a clerk's handwriting from 1978, simply as Legacy Obligations, MISC, filed and forgotten, in the way institutional memory so often loses the specific in favor of the general. Inside was a photostat copy of a 1965 letter agreement, its language plain enough that even a first-year paralegal could parse it, granting a 2% participation in net revenue derived from the corrected spindle process and its direct derivatives to one Eleanor Halverson, along with a thin folder of internal memos tracking sporadic payments through 1981, a returned mail notation from 1979, and then nothing. 45 years of nothing. Sophia had, with the diligence of someone new enough to still care intensely about getting things exactly right, cross-referenced the spindle process named in the letter against current product lines, and produced a figure that made her sit very still at her desk for several minutes before she brought it to her supervisor. The corrected process described in that 1965 letter, refined and modified over 60 years, but structurally traceable in a direct, documentable line, underpinned a manufacturing method still in active use across several of Vail Precision Systems' highest margin current product families. When the file reached Arthur's desk, he had read the 1965 letter twice and then sat alone in his office for nearly an hour with the door closed, something his longtime staff knew well enough not to interrupt. He remembered the letter. He remembered writing it, or rather having it drafted, and insisting on the plain language himself over his father's lawyer friend's mild objection that it was underspecified. He remembered a gravel parking lot, and a young woman with steady hands, and an unhurried way of looking at a broken part, and the particular specific relief of watching her identify calmly the exact flaw that had been about to sink his entire fragile company. He remembered telling her that if the company ever amounted to anything, he wasn't going to forget who had kept it alive. He had, in every practical sense, forgotten. Not on purpose. Not through any single decision he could point to and call a betrayal. But through 45 years of trusting a growing organization to handle what he no longer personally tracked, he had allowed a promise made in a gravel lot to a 21-year-old woman to quietly dissolve into a filing cabinet, and the shame of that discovery sat in his chest with a weight that surprised him. At 86, when he thought he had made his peace with most of his regrets, he had ordered a full search. It had not been simple. Eleanor Halverson no longer existed in any legal sense under that name. A marriage certificate from 1966, found eventually through county records, connected her to a Robert Mercer of Dayton, Ohio. Property records, tax records, and eventually, with Priscilla's help and a retired private investigator Arthur trusted from decades of occasional business use, an address on Ridgeline Drive in Kettering had surfaced, followed distressingly by a very recent sale record, a forwarding trail that led, after several more days of searching, to a facility called Brookhaven Senior Living. Arthur had not called ahead. Priscilla had wanted to. It was, she'd argued, the more appropriate, less alarming approach. But Arthur, sitting in the back of the car on the drive over, had said only, "I told her I wouldn't forget. I'm not going to have someone else deliver that apology for me over the phone." And Priscilla had understood, finally, that this was not entirely a business matter, whatever the eventual financial and legal shape of it turned out to be. Now he stood in the doorway of room 114, leaning slightly on his cane, and looked at a woman he had not seen in person in almost 50 years. Eleanor Mercer sat in a vinyl recliner by the window, a small cloth pouch resting on the arm of the chair beneath her right hand. She was smaller than he remembered. Everyone is smaller, decades later, than the version memory keeps. Her hair white, where it had been dark brown. Her hands marked with the particular knuckled swelling of long-standing arthritis. But her eyes, when they found his face, held the same unhurried, assessing quality he remembered from a gravel lot in 1965, the look of someone taking an honest measurement before forming an opinion. "Arthur Vale," Nell said, and it was not quite a question. "Eleanor," he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. "I am so sorry it took me this long to come find you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Priya, hovering uncertainly near the door, murmured something about getting an extra chair and slipped away. And Priscilla remained a respectful few steps back in the hallway. And Arthur Vale, founder and chairman of a company worth the better part of $1 billion, stood in the doorway of a nursing home room and waited, the way a much younger and much less powerful man might have waited, to see whether the woman inside would let him in. "You'd better sit down," Nell said finally. "You look like the walk from the parking lot cost you something." It was such a plain, unromantic thing to say. Not "how have you been," or "it's been so long," but a simple, practical observation, the kind she might once have made about a man's gait on a shop floor before deciding whether his knee was going to hold up through a double shift, that it broke something loose in Arthur's chest, a tightness he had been carrying since Sofia Delgado first brought him that file. He laughed unsteadily and lowered himself into the chair Priya brought, setting his cane against the nightstand. "You always did see straight through people," he said. "Not through everyone," Nell said. "Only through the ones who don't try to hide it too hard. What are you doing here, Arthur? It's been, what, 50 years?" "51, he said. "I found something 6 weeks ago in an old file, going through the company's early records. A letter from 1965. Nell's hand, resting on the cloth pouch on the arm of the chair, went very still. "I remember the letter," she said carefully. "I want to ask you something," Arthur said, "and I want you to tell me the truth, because I have a feeling I already know the answer, and I need to hear you say it anyway. Did you ever receive the payments that letter promised all the way through?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that Priscilla, in the hallway, shifted her weight. "They stopped," Nell said finally. "A long time ago, 1980, 81, somewhere around there. I always assumed the arrangement had simply run its course. I never asked. I had 2 small children and a house to run, Arthur. It wasn't the kind of thing I had time to chase." Arthur closed his eyes briefly. "It didn't run its course," he said. "The account still exists. Nobody closed it. Nobody canceled it. It just got lost. In an acquisition, an address change, 45 years of nobody at my company thinking to look for you and me, God forgive me, assuming for 4.5 decades that it had all been handled the way I meant for it to be handled. Nell looked at him for a long moment, and there was no triumph in her expression, and no particular softness either, only the same steady, assessing quality that had once told a young Arthur Vale exactly which fixture pin was bent. "Do you know what happened to me 2 months ago, Arthur? Tell me." "My daughter sold my house without ever really asking me, not in the way that counts. She put me in this building with one suitcase and told me it was temporary, and it wasn't. I still don't know exactly how much my home sold for, or where all of the money went, though I have started to have some very uncomfortable guesses. My son let it happen, because standing up to his sister has never been a habit of his. And here you are, telling me that a piece of paper I signed on a car dashboard 61 years ago has been quietly worth God knows how much this whole time, sitting untouched in a filing cabinet at your company, while I've spent the last 2 months learning what it feels like to be an inconvenience to the people who are supposed to love you." She said it evenly, without raising her voice, and it landed harder for that restraint than any shout could have. "I don't have a way to make that right," Arthur said quietly. "I know that. I'm not here pretending I can hand you a check and undo what your family did, or the 45 years my company let you fall through the cracks. But I can tell you the truth about what you're owed. And I can help you get the people around you to see it if that's something you want. I'm not here to rescue you, Eleanor. God knows you didn't need rescuing 61 years ago, and I don't imagine you need it now. I'm here because I made you a promise in a parking lot, and I broke it without ever meaning to. And I would like, before I run out of time to fix things, to at least try." Nell was quiet for a moment, her hand finally moving to pick up the cloth pouch from the arm of the chair, turning it slowly between her fingers without opening it. "Do you still have the red notebook?" Arthur asked suddenly. "You used to carry it everywhere. All your sketches, your notes on that spindle fixture. I need to know if it survived. The company archive has a copy of the letter, but the notebook would show you're working in your own hand, dated. It would settle any question anyone could raise, and knowing you, it's more thorough than anything my lawyers could produce." Nell's jaw tightened very slightly. "I don't know," she admitted. "It should be. It was in a nightstand drawer at the house. Whether it made it into a box my son kept, or a box that went to the donation truck, or somewhere else entirely, I genuinely don't know, Arthur. There's a great deal about the last 2 months I still don't know." Arthur believes that notebook could prove exactly what he remembers about that day in 1965, the fixture, the diagnosis, the fix that saved his company. But part of Nell wonders if there's something in those pages even Arthur doesn't remember. Before we find out what's actually in it, if you've made it this far into Nell's story, go ahead and hit subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach more people. Now, back to room 114. It took 4 days to find the notebook. Gary, called by his mother with a tightness in her voice he hadn't heard from her before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more deliberate, went out to his garage that same evening and began pulling totes down off the shelving unit along the back wall, working by the light of a single bare bulb, sneezing at the dust of 18 months' worth of unsorted boxes. He found Robert's old tax returns. He found a box of Christmas ornaments nobody had unpacked in 3 years. He found, at the bottom of the third tote, wedged beside a stack of canceled checks and an expired passport, a red spiral-bound notebook with a cracked cover, its pages soft and curled at the edges. And when he opened it and saw his mother's handwriting, younger, rounder, careful, filling page after page with sketches of gears and shafts and columns of numbers, he did not understand. Something in his chest tightened in a way he did not have language for yet. He brought it to Brookhaven himself on a Thursday evening without calling ahead, and found Priscilla Odom sitting in the small visitors' lounge outside room 114 with her leather portfolio, and Arthur Vale sitting in the vinyl recliner that had become, over 4 days of visits, unofficially his. "I found it," Gary said, standing awkwardly in the doorway, the notebook held out in front of him like an offering he wasn't sure would be accepted. "In my garage. I didn't look through it much. It felt like it wasn't mine to look through." Nell took the notebook from her son's hands. For a moment, she simply held it, her thumb running along the cracked spine, and then she opened it, slowly, to a page near the middle, where a cross-section sketch of a spindle assembly sat beside a column of measurements in her own younger hand, dated February 11th, 1965, with a small notation in the margin, "Fixture pin, worn Troin03, not the material. Confirmed W.AV." Arthur leaned forward, and when he saw the page, something in his face changed completely. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the exact day. I remember standing at that counter while you wrote that down." "You always did like to watch," Nell said. And there was, for the first time since he'd walked into her room 4 days earlier, the faint ghost of a smile at the corner of her mouth. Gary stood in the doorway, watching his mother and a stranger in an expensive gray coat pore over a notebook he had never once, in 52 years, thought to ask about, and he felt something shift inside him. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but the first uncomfortable stirring of a question he had never let himself ask. "Who was my mother before she was my mother?" "Mr. Vale," Gary said finally, "can I ask what this is actually about? Mom mentioned something on the phone about an old letter, but I didn't. I don't understand what any of this has to do with the company that makes those turbine parts you see on the news sometimes." Arthur looked at Gary for a moment, and then at Nell, as if silently asking permission to answer. Nell nodded once. "Sit down, Gary," she said. "This is going to take a little while." Arthur explained it the way he had explained few things in his life, plainly, without the polish of boardroom language, laying out the 1965 letter, the 2% participation, the spindle process, the 45 years of silence. He opened Priscilla's leather portfolio and produced a copy of the original agreement, its photostat pages slightly yellowed, Nell's maiden name signature at the bottom, in the same rounder hand, visible throughout the red notebook. Gary read the letter twice, his face going through several expressions in succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked almost like shame, though he would not have named it that yet, not out loud. 2%, he said slowly. Of what exactly? 60 years of revenue from some kind of process? It's more complicated than a straight percentage would suggest, Arthur said carefully. The process itself has been modified many times over 60 years, and untangling exactly what portion of current revenue traces directly back to the 1965 correction versus later independent engineering work is a legitimate and fairly involved accounting question. One I intend to have handled by an outside firm your mother chooses, not mine. So there's no question of my company grading its own homework. But even a conservative, defensible accounting, back payments through 1981, reasonable interest, and a negotiated buyout of the remaining participation rights going forward, since neither your mother nor my company particularly wants an open-ended royalty arrangement running for the rest of her life. Lands, by my finance team's preliminary estimate, somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 million. The room went very quiet. Gary sat down heavily in the second chair, the notebook's photostat letter still in his hands, and, for a long moment, he did not say anything at all. "Mom," he said finally, his voice unsteady, "did you know? This whole time, did you know any of this?" "No," Nell said simply. "I knew I'd signed a piece of paper as a young woman. I did not know it had ever amounted to anything, and I certainly did not know it still existed. I have spent the last 2 months in a nursing home, believing I had nothing left to my name but a suitcase your sister packed for me. So no, Gary, I did not know." Gary flinched visibly at the word "your sister" and at the flat, unornamented way his mother said it. Not an accusation exactly, but a fact laid down like a measurement, precise and impossible to argue with. The layers came slowly, over the following weeks, the way Arthur had promised they would. Not a single dramatic revelation, but a steady accumulation of confirmations, each one deepening what had come before. Sofia Delgado, the young archivist, flew out from the company's Columbus headquarters personally to examine the red notebook, cross-referencing its dated entries against surviving Continental Gauge production logs from the same period, logs that had, remarkably, survived the 1978 acquisition intact in a records warehouse the company still maintained. The dates matched, the measurements matched. A retired Vail precision engineer named Duke Ferris, the same Duke Ferris who had welded together the redesigned cooling rack in 1964, now 91 years old and living in an assisted care facility of his own outside Cincinnati, was located and interviewed by Priscilla and confirmed in a shaky but clear voice recorded for the company's legal file that he remembered the girl from Continental Gauge perfectly, remembered her name, remembered that Arthur Vail had told him more than once over the years that the company would not have survived its first 2 contracts without her. An outside forensic accounting firm, engaged at Nell's insistence and paid for, at her further insistence, out of an advance against the eventual settlement rather than as a gift from Arthur, spent 6 weeks tracing the spindle process's evolution through Vail Precision Systems product history, confirming what Sophia's initial estimate had suggested. The corrected cooling and fixture methodology from 1965, while modified substantially over 60 years, remained a documented structural ancestor of a manufacturing process, still generating significant revenue for the company's current high-precision product lines. The final settlement negotiated over the following 2 months by an attorney Nell selected herself, a sharp, no-nonsense Dayton lawyer named Renata Voss, recommended by Priscilla but chosen and retained independently by Nell, with instructions that she wanted someone who works for me, not for Arthur's comfort, arrived at a figure of $12,400,000, back payments reconstructed from available records, a negotiated interest rate the accounting firm agreed was defensible, and a lump sum buyout of all future participation rights under the original 1965 agreement, closing the account permanently and cleanly. It was not, by the standards of the very wealthy, an extraordinary fortune. It was not, by any standard that mattered to an 82-year-old woman who had spent 2 months believing she owned nothing but a suitcase, anything less than a complete restoration of her ability to decide for herself what the rest of her life was going to look like. Vail Precision Systems, separately and at Arthur's direct instruction, undertook a public correction of its own historical record, a revised founder's history posted to the company's website and included in materials for its upcoming leadership transition, acknowledging by name the contribution of Eleanor Mercer to the company's survival during its first critical year, alongside a photograph of the original 1965 letter and a page from the red notebook. Arthur also established, with the company's board approving it unanimously and with unusual speed once the full story was known internally, the Mercer Apprenticeship Workshop, a hands-on precision manufacturing training program for young workers with a particular publicly stated priority given to women entering the trade, housed in a renovated corner of the company's original Dayton facility. Nell, when Arthur first proposed the program to her, sitting once again in the vinyl recliner in room 114, had been visibly uncomfortable. "I don't need a building with my name on it, Arthur," she said. "I did a job. A lot of people did jobs. I'd rather the money go somewhere useful than have my name stamped on a plaque nobody reads." "That's exactly why it should have your name on it," Arthur said. "You never once, in 60 years, tried to make yourself bigger than the work. That's rare enough that it's worth teaching to the next generation of Duke Ferrises and Eleanor Halversons coming up through the trade. Let them learn it from your example instead of having to figure it out the hard way, the way you did." Nell had not fully relented that day, but 3 weeks later, after her own attorney reviewed the program's structure and confirmed it carried no strings that compromised her control over the settlement itself, she agreed, on the condition, she told Arthur firmly, that the program's mission statement include language about valuing people whose work goes unnoticed, language she dictated herself in her own words, and that Arthur's communications team, somewhat to their own surprise, kept exactly as written. The confrontation with Denise came on a warm afternoon in late August, in the small conference room Brookhaven kept available for family meetings, a room with a round table and a box of tissues placed, with grim institutional foresight, in its center. By then, Denise knew most of it. She had known, in fact, for almost 3 weeks. Gary had told her in a tense phone call that had ended with both of them raising their voices for the first time in years. And Denise had spent those 3 weeks oscillating between disbelief, a scrambling private effort to calculate what any of it might mean for her, and a rehearsed defensive posture she brought with her into the conference room like armor. "Mom," she started, before she had even fully sat down, "I want you to know that everything I did because I was worried about you. I know it maybe doesn't look that way now with all of this." She gestured vaguely, encompassing Arthur's absent but implied presence, the settlement, the entire unraveling of the last 2 months. "But I was scared. You'd fallen twice. I didn't know what else to do." "I believe that you were scared," Nell said. She had, by then, had many weeks to prepare for this conversation, turning it over the way she once turned over a rejected part, looking for the actual flaw beneath the surface explanation. "I don't believe fear is the whole reason, Denise. I've seen the closing statement from the sale of my house. I know what it sold for. I know how much of that money made it into an account for my care, and I have a fairly clear idea from Renata of where the rest of it went. The lake house. Your credit cards. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I already know." Denise's face went through several rapid changes: anger, then something closer to panic, then, briefly, an unguarded flash of shame that Nell recognized, because it was the same flash of shame she had seen cross Gary's face in the garage 4 months earlier when he'd handed over the notebook. "I was going to pay it back," Denise said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "I swear to you, Mom, I never meant to just take it. I was drowning, and the house was just sitting there, and I told myself it was fine because it would all be mine eventually anyway. And I know how that sounds. I know it sounds," Nell said quietly, "like you decided what was mine belonged to you before I was even gone. That's the part I need you to sit with, Denise. Not the money. The decision underneath the money that you'd already, somewhere in your head, stopped seeing this as my life you were managing and started seeing it as an inheritance you were simply collecting early." Denise put her face in her hands. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the building's HVAC system, and somewhere down the hall, the distant rattle of a medication cart. "What happens now?" Denise finally asked, not looking up. "Now," Nell said, "I'm going to tell you what I've decided, and I need you to understand that I've thought about this for a long time, and it isn't punishment, though I imagine it's going to feel like it. I want the difference between what the house actually sold for and what ended up in my care account, repaid, not as a gift to me, not on your own schedule whenever it's convenient, but on a formal repayment plan that Renata will draw up, with interest, the same as any other debt. I am not going to bail out the lake house. That was your decision, made without me, and it's going to have to be your consequence to work out, without my checkbook to soften it. I'm not cutting you out of my life, Denise, but I am changing my will, and I am removing you from any financial authority over anything of mine, effective immediately. And I need you to understand that trust, once it's spent this way, doesn't come back just because the account balance does." "And Gary?" Denise asked, a note of something bitter creeping into her voice. "Does Gary get to just walk away clean because he wasn't the one signing the papers? Gary went along with things he should have questioned," Nell said. "That's its own failure, and I've told him so directly, more than once. But there's a difference between a man who let his sister lead him somewhere he shouldn't have followed, and a sister who built the road on purpose because she needed somewhere for the money to go. I'm not blind to Gary's part in this, Denise. I'm just not going to pretend the two of you did the same thing, because you didn't. Nell's granddaughter, Casey, Denise's 24-year-old daughter, a community college student working toward an associate's degree in mechanical engineering technology, largely, if she was honest, because she'd always liked taking things apart more than she liked most of her other coursework, had not been part of the original decisions at all. She had been away at an internship in Columbus when her grandmother was moved to Brookhaven and had absorbed her mother's version of events. Grandma needed more care than we could give her at home, without much reason at the time to question it. It was Casey who, hearing the fuller story secondhand from her Uncle Gary over a tense family dinner in September, drove to Brookhaven the following Saturday without telling her mother, and sat across from her grandmother in the small visitors' lounge, and asked with the direct, unguarded curiosity of someone young enough not to have learned yet how to soften a hard question. Grandma, is it true you basically solved an engineering problem that saved his whole company? Like, actually solved it? With math? Nell had laughed. A real laugh. The first one Casey had heard from her grandmother in longer than she could remember. With a caliper and some sketches, Nell said, "Not much different from what you're learning now, if your professors are teaching it right. Come here, I'll show you." She had brought out the red notebook, and for 2 hours that Saturday afternoon, and then for many Saturdays after that, Nell walked her granddaughter through pages of 60-year-old sketches, explaining fixture tolerances and thermal distortion and the particular discipline of trusting an instrument over a hopeful guess. And Casey, who had spent her whole childhood believing her grandmother's most notable skill was mending torn hems, began to understand slowly and with a growing, quiet awe exactly how much of her family's assumptions about this woman had simply been wrong. By the following spring, Casey had transferred into a full engineering program. In part, she told Nell more than once, because of those Saturday afternoons in the visitors' lounge. Nell, in turn, had quietly arranged, through her attorney and without telling Casey until the paperwork was final, to fund the remainder of her granddaughter's education directly, not through Denise, not routed through any family account that could become entangled with anyone else's debts, but placed in trust for Casey alone. "I'm not doing this because your mother let me down," Nell told her the day she explained the arrangement. "I'm doing it because you're the first person in this family who thought to ask me a real question about my own life in longer than I can remember. That matters more to me than you probably realize." Arthur Vale's own reckoning unfolded more quietly over the same months, largely in conversations that took place in the same small visitors' lounge, in the vinyl-chaired room that had, by autumn, become something like a regular meeting place for two old people working out, in their own unhurried way, what they owed each other. "I keep thinking about how easy it would have been," Arthur admitted to her one afternoon in October, "for me to have simply checked, once, at any point in 45 years, a phone call, a note in a file review. It wouldn't have taken much." "You built a company that employs 4,000 people," Nell said. I imagine there were a great many things that would have taken very little effort and that you nonetheless never got around to. That's not an excuse for what happened to me. But it's not a moral failing unique to you either, Arthur. It's just what happens when trust gets handed down through enough layers of an organization that no single person feels responsible for checking it. That's more forgiving than I deserve. I'm not forgiving you because you deserve it, Nell said. I'm telling you what actually happened, the same way I'd tell you what actually happened with a bent fixture pin. Guilt is a comfortable thing to sit in, Arthur, because it lets you feel bad without necessarily doing anything different. I'd rather you spend the energy making sure your company never lets something like this happen to the next person who helps build it and then gets forgotten. Arthur was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. You always did cut straight to the part that actually mattered, he said finally. I used to find that unsettling back when I was 24 and scared my whole company was about to fall apart. I find it a great deal more comforting now. By the following spring, nearly a year after the day Nell first arrived at Brookhaven with a suitcase that weighed almost nothing, her life had reorganized itself into a shape none of it could have predicted, and yet, in its essential character, into something recognizably her own. She did not leave Brookhaven right away, though she could have, easily, the moment the settlement cleared. For the first several months she stayed, partly out of a genuine, unhurried caution about her own health and mobility, and partly because she had, without quite planning to, built real friendships there. A retired school teacher named Wilhelmina Sachs, 2 doors down, with whom she played gin rummy most evenings, and a quiet, courtly widower named Frank Oduya, who had taken, with visible pleasure, to helping Nell repair small broken items brought in by other residents. A toaster here, a jammed drawer there, in a corner of the activity room that had gradually and informally become known among the staff as Mrs. Mercer's workshop. What had changed, fundamentally, was not the walls around her, but her relationship to them. She stayed at Brookhaven that first winter because she chose to, not because she had nowhere else to go, and the distinction, she told Casey more than once, mattered more than any single amenity a fancier facility might have offered. In March, when she finally did move, it was into a small, accessible, one-bedroom cottage in an independent living community 20 minutes from Brookhaven, chosen entirely on her own terms, close enough to Wilhelmina and Frank that both of them visited weekly, with a small workshop nook off the kitchen where the red notebook now lived on a shelf beside a framed photograph, not of Robert this time, but of herself at 21, standing in front of a lathe at Continental Gauge, a photograph Duke Ferris, of all people, had unearthed from an old company scrapbook and mailed to her with a shaky handwritten note that simply said, "Never forgot you, kid." Gary visited every other week, and slowly, awkwardly, without any single dramatic moment of reconciliation, rebuilt something with his mother that was not quite what it had been before. Warier, more honest, but in its own way sturdier for having survived an honest accounting rather than a comfortable silence. Denise visited less often, and when she did, the conversations remained careful, businesslike, the debt repayment plan, a quiet, ongoing presence in the background of every exchange, A bridge neither of them pretended had been fully rebuilt, but a bridge nonetheless, load-bearing, if not yet beautiful. The Halverson Mercer Apprenticeship Workshop opened that June in a renovated corner bay of Vale Precision Systems' original Dayton facility, with 14 apprentices in its first cohort, 6 of them young women. Nell attended the opening, briefly, and only after extracting a promise from Arthur that there would be no speeches given in her honor, a promise he mostly kept, aside from a short, unpolished remark about a young woman who had once told him a machine part doesn't lie about what's actually wrong with it, and how that lesson had outlasted nearly everything else he'd learned in 60 years of running a company. Nell herself taught occasionally that first year, not as a formal instructor, but dropping by on Thursday afternoons to sit with a handful of apprentices and walk them through the same lessons Eric Halverson had once given her, translated 60 years later into her own voice. She kept the caliper with her through all of it, closing it with the same small, familiar click at the end of each visit, tucking it back into its cloth pouch before she left. It was in the workshop's second autumn, on a gray afternoon, much like the one on which she had first arrived at Brookhaven, that Nell finally set the caliper down for good. There was a young apprentice in that second cohort, a 19-year-old named Amara Reyes, no relation, as it happened, to Thomas Reyes, the company's incoming CEO, though the coincidence made everyone smile when it came up, who reminded Nell, in small, specific ways she couldn't quite articulate, of the girl she had been at that age. Quiet, watchful, the kind of student who noticed the flaw in a fixture before anyone pointed it out to her, and who had, on more than one Thursday afternoon, sat a little longer than the others to keep talking after the formal lesson ended. "Where did you even learn to see things like that?" Amara asked her one October afternoon, turning a slightly warped test piece over in her hands, frowning at it the exact way Nell remembered frowning at her own first rejected parts. 63 years earlier. Nell was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket, drew out the small cloth pouch, and opened it, and lifted the caliper into the light, its brass worn dark and smooth from more than 60 years of careful use. "A man named Eric Halvorsen gave me this when I was younger than you are now," she said. "He told me the tool doesn't care what answer you're hoping for. It only tells you what's true. I've spent most of my life finding out how much that applies to more than metal." She held the caliper out. "I think it's about time somebody besides me learned that the hard way instead of the easy way," Nell said. "It's yours now, if you'll use it right." Amara took it carefully, almost reverently, in both hands, and closed its jaws once, testing the mechanism, and the small metallic click that resulted, the same sound Nell had first heard in a shop that smelled of cutting oil in the spring of 1962, the same sound that had echoed quietly through 64 years of measurements taken, decisions made, and finally a life reclaimed, carried, this time, into a future that belonged to someone else. Nell watched the girl slip the caliper carefully into her own coat pocket, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily name, that the measurement had finally come out exactly right. She thought, sometimes, in the quiet months that followed, about forgiveness, about Denise, about the slow, uneven repair still underway between them, about whether regret that arrives honestly, eventually, is worth the same as trust that was never broken in the first place. She did not know, even now, whether those two things could ever fully be made equal. She suspected they couldn't, not entirely, that some kinds of trust, once spent, come back changed rather than whole, the way a piece of metal, once bent and straightened again, never quite tests the same as a piece that was never bent at all. But she had stopped needing an easy answer to that question. She had learned a long time ago, and then, more painfully, all over again at 82, that some measurements simply take longer than others to settle, and that the honest ones are worth taking regardless of how uncomfortable the number turns out to be. If someone in your own life once trusted you with more than you realized at the time, and you got it wrong, do you think regret alone is enough? Or does trust have to be rebuilt in some harder, slower way before it can really be called forgiveness? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And if Nell's story stayed with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Somewhere in Dayton, Ohio, in a small workshop bay, bearing two names instead of one, a 19-year-old apprentice closed an old brass-fitted caliper over a piece of freshly machined steel, checked the reading twice the way she'd been taught, and smiled quietly at what the tool told her was true.